The first time I met Jeffrey Dahmer, he sat across from me in a sterile prison visitation room, his hands folded neatly on the metal table between us. His glasses reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, making it difficult to see his eyes clearly. I'd interviewed dozens of criminals before, but something about Dahmer's calm demeanor sent a chill through me. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. "I didn't want them to die," he said. "I just wanted them to stay with me forever." The matter-of-fact way he delivered those words made my skin crawl. Here was a man who had taken 17 lives, dismembered their bodies, and kept their parts as souvenirs, speaking as if he were describing a harmless desire for companionship. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral as I scribbled in my notepad. What I didn't realize then was that I would become the last person to hear his full confession before everything changed. I'd been following Dahmer's case since July 19th, 1991, when police officers were flagged down by a man running through the streets with a handcuff dangling from one wrist. Tracy Edwards told them a bizarre story about a strange man who had tried to restrain him, threatened him with a knife, and talked about eating his heart. When officers followed Edwards back to apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, they had no idea what horrors awaited them. The first thing that hit the responding officers was the smell, a sickening, putrid odor that permeated the small apartment. One officer opened the refrigerator looking for the source and found a human head staring back at him from the shelf. Another discovered a drawer full of Polaroid photos showing dismembered bodies in various poses. Within hours, the apartment would yield evidence of one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. As investigators continued their search, the true extent of Dahmer's crimes became clear. 7 skulls, 4 severed heads. Various body parts stored in the refrigerator, freezer, and acid-filled containers. A 57-gallon drum in the corner of the bedroom contained decomposing torsos and limbs dissolved in acid. The meticulous organization of these remains suggested not frenzied violence but calculated preservation. When news broke, Milwaukee was stunned. How could this have happened without anyone noticing? How could someone like Dahmer exist among us, shopping at the same grocery stores, walking the same streets? The victims, mostly young gay men of color, had names, families, dreams. Anthony Sears, Konarak Synthasimphone, Errol Lindsay, Curtis Straughter. The list went on. 17 souls in total, their lives cut short by a man who simply wanted them to stay. I learned that one of the victims had been a regular at a bar where my college roommate used to work. Just 2 degrees of separation between me and this unspeakable tragedy. That's when I decided to go deeper. I needed to understand how someone becomes Jeffrey Dahmer. What twisted path leads a person to commit such atrocities? As a crime reporter with a background in psychology, I convinced my editor to let me pursue the story from a different angle. Not just the sensational headlines, but the making of a monster. I wanted to trace Dahmer's life from the beginning, to find the moment when everything changed, or to discover if he had always been destined for this particular darkness. The Oxford Apartments complex was a nondescript building in a struggling neighborhood. Nothing about its beige exterior suggested the nightmares contained inside. Neighbors later reported occasional strange noises and persistent odd smells, but in a building with poor insulation and maintenance issues, these complaints had seemed routine. One resident, Sopa Princewill, had repeatedly called the building manager about a terrible stench seeping through her ceiling from Dahmer's apartment directly above. Each time, the management offered vague promises, but no action. The system had failed, not just the victims, but also those who lived unknowingly beside a predator. I wondered how many warning signs had been missed, how many opportunities to stop him had slipped through the cracks of bureaucracy and indifference. When I visited the apartment complex during my initial reporting, it was already becoming a macabre tourist attraction. People drove by slowly, pointing at the windows of Unit 213, taking photos. Some left flowers for the victims, others seemed drawn by morbid curiosity. The building manager refused my requests for an interview, hurrying away when I approached him in the parking lot. But I managed to speak with several residents, each struggling to reconcile their ordinary lives with the extraordinary horror that had existed in their midst. I held the door for him once, one woman told me, her voice barely above a whisper. He thanked me. He seemed so normal. That word, normal came up repeatedly. It was as if everyone was trying to identify what they had missed, what invisible mark should have warned them. I started with his childhood in Doylestown, Ohio. Born on May 21st, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's early years seemed relatively normal on the surface. But interviews with his father revealed troubling signs. Young Jeffrey had been fascinated with dead animals, collecting roadkill and dissecting them in the woods behind their house. Lionel initially encouraged this interest, thinking it might lead to a career in science or medicine. He even showed his son how to clean and preserve animal bones. In retrospect, this encouragement haunts him. "I thought I was nurturing scientific curiosity," Lionel told me, his voice breaking. "I never imagined I was feeding something else." When Jeffrey was 6, hernia surgery left him temporarily withdrawn and anxious. Around the same time, the arrival of a younger brother shifted attention away from him. Joyce suffered from depression and was frequently bedridden, while the marriage deteriorated into bitter arguments that echoed through their home. By the time Jeffrey reached adolescence, he had become increasingly isolated and withdrawn. Former classmates described him as quiet, awkward, and often the target of bullying. One remembered him bringing alcohol to school in a thermos, the beginning of a dependency that would follow him into adulthood. Yet no one saw signs of violence. He was just, "They're there!" one former classmate said. "Like a ghost moving through the hallways." I visited Revere High School, where Dahmer had graduated in 1978. The building hadn't changed much. The same beige brick exterior, the same fluorescent-lit hallways where teenage Jeffrey had drifted through his days. His yearbook photo showed a thin, unremarkable boy with feathered hair and large glasses, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Teachers who remembered him described a student who was present but never fully engaged, who rarely caused trouble but never connected either. One former teacher recalled an incident when Dahmer had participated in a school prank, sneaking into another school's yearbook photo. "He seemed so pleased to be included," she said. "It was one of the only times I saw him genuinely smile. These glimpses of normalcy made the later horrors even more difficult to comprehend." Dahmer's first murder came just weeks after his high school graduation in 1978. Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker, accepted Dahmer's invitation back to his house for beers. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, strangled him, dismembered the body, and scattered the remains around his property. He would later tell investigators that he didn't want Hicks to leave. This pattern, the desperate need to prevent abandonment, would repeat throughout his killing spree. After a brief, failed attempt at college and a short stint in the army, where his drinking led to a discharge, Dahmer drifted. He moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, where his behavior grew increasingly concerning. He was arrested for indecent exposure in 1982 and 1986. The second time, a 13-year-old boy was involved. I drove past the West Allis house once during my investigation. A neat, well-maintained property on a quiet suburban street. Dahmer's grandmother, Catherine, had been, by all accounts, a stable influence in his life, attending church regularly and maintaining a tidy home. Yet, even under her roof, Dahmer's darkness continued to grow. He brought men home when she was away at church. Once, she found a mannequin he had stolen from a department store in his closet. Another time, she noticed a terrible smell coming from the garage, later revealed to be the decomposing body of one of his victims. She couldn't have known, of course. Who would imagine such horrors? Yet the juxtaposition was jarring. Floral curtains and freshly baked cookies existing alongside unimaginable depravity. It challenged my understanding of evil, suggesting it could exist not only in abandoned buildings or dark alleys, but in ordinary bedrooms on ordinary streets. During our interviews, Dahmer spoke about this period with detached precision, as if describing someone else's life. "I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body," he told me, his gaze fixed on some invisible point behind me. "I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop." When I asked what drove him to kill, he paused before answering, "Control. When they were dead, they couldn't leave me." The more time I spent with Dahmer, the more I recognized a profound emptiness at his core, a void he had tried to fill with the most extreme form of possession imaginable. It was disturbing how articulate he could be about his own pathology, as if part of him had always been studying the rest. Our interviews took place over several months, each lasting about 2 hours. Prison regulations meant I couldn't bring recording devices, so I relied on extensive notes, writing furiously to capture his words verbatim. Dahmer never raised his voice or showed strong emotion. Even when describing the most horrific acts, he maintained a calm, almost clinical detachment. Occasionally, he would make a self-deprecating joke, a flash of unexpected humor that would catch me off guard and remind me of his humanity, a reminder I found deeply unsettling. After each session, I would sit in my car in the prison parking lot, sometimes for an hour or more, trying to process what I had heard, trying to reconcile the soft-spoken man in the visitor's room with the monster described in police reports. What struck me most during our conversations was how ordinary Dahmer could seem. If you met him at a bus stop or in a grocery store, nothing would signal the horrors he was capable of. He was polite, soft-spoken, and occasionally showed flashes of dry humor. This ordinariness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of him. It challenged the comfortable notion that monsters look like monsters. I found myself analyzing his mannerisms, searching for clues I might have missed if I'd encountered him before his crimes came to light. Would I have sensed something was off? Would any of us? The thought kept me awake at night. As our interviews progressed, I began to see patterns in Dahmer's life that seemed significant. His parents' bitter divorce when he was 18. His mother taking his younger brother and leaving him behind with his father. His grandmother eventually asking him to move out of her house. Each separation seemed to trigger a period of escalation in his crimes. When I pointed this out, he nodded slowly. "I've thought about that too," he said. Each time someone left, I felt emptier. It wasn't an excuse, nothing could excuse what he had done, but it offered a glimpse into the broken machinery of his mind. Dahmer had attempted to solve his fear of abandonment by ensuring his victims could never leave, transforming living, autonomous humans into permanent possessions. The logic was as twisted as it was tragically comprehensible. In his apartment at 24 North 25th Street, Dahmer established a hunting ground. The location was strategic, close to gay bars, like Club 219 and La Cage, where he could easily find victims. His method was consistent: approach attractive young men, offer them money to pose for photographs or watch videos at his apartment, then drug their drinks with sleeping pills. Once they were unconscious, he would strangle them and carry out his ritualistic dismemberment. I wanted to create zombies, he confessed during our third interview. People who would stay with me without leaving. He described drilling holes in some victims' skulls while they were drugged but still alive, injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water in an attempt to create a permanent, compliant companion. The most chilling part of this confession was the obvious longing in his voice, a desperate desire for connection that had twisted into something monstrous. Dahmer didn't see himself as a traditional serial killer seeking the thrill of murder. He saw himself as desperately lonely, attempting to create companions who couldn't abandon him. In his distorted thinking, he was pursuing love, not death. This revelation didn't generate sympathy in me. The horrors he had inflicted were too great for that, but it did create a disturbing kind of clarity. I began to see his crimes not as incomprehensible evil, but as the terminal point of a deeply human fear of abandonment, magnified through the lens of severe psychological disturbance and alcohol addiction. Through interviews with those who had encountered Dahmer and declined his invitations, I pieced together his approach. He was charming when he needed to be, with a disarming smile and the ability to appear completely harmless. He bought me a drink and seemed so normal, one man told me. Just a lonely guy looking for company. Something told me to leave anyway. I can't explain it. Others weren't so lucky. Dahmer targeted marginalized individuals. Often men of color, sometimes homeless or living on society's edges, whose disappearances might not raise immediate alarms. The racial component of his victim selection didn't stem from hate, Dahmer insisted, but from aesthetic preference. I wasn't convinced. The pattern reflected deeper societal issues, whose lives we notice missing, whose deaths we investigate thoroughly. I spoke with families of several victims, sitting in living rooms filled with photos of sons and brothers whose lives had been cut short. Their grief was raw, their anger justified. Many felt the police had failed them, not taking their missing persons reports seriously because of race or sexuality. If white college students had been disappearing, they would have found him sooner, one mother told me, tears streaming down her face. She was right. The case exposed not just the horrors one man could inflict, but the inequities in our system that had allowed him to continue for so long. Some officers had even returned Conorak's synthesophone, a 14-year-old Laotian boy, to Dahmer's apartment, despite witnesses trying to intervene. The boy was drugged, confused, bleeding, and the officers handed him back to his killer, accepting Dahmer's explanation that they were having a lover's quarrel. Synthesophone became Dahmer's 13th victim that same night. Tracy Edwards, the man who escaped and led police to Dahmer, described his terrifying experience in detail. He was different once we got to his place, Edwards recalled when I interviewed him. His whole demeanor changed. His eyes went cold. Edwards said Dahmer had handcuffed one of his wrists and threatened him with a knife, forcing him to look at Polaroid photos of dismembered bodies while the movie The Exorcist III played in the background. Edwards managed to punch Dahmer and flee, flagging down police officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, who then investigated the apartment. Edwards' survival was pure chance, a moment of opportunity seized in desperation. If not for his escape, how many more might have died? Edwards' life, after his encounter with Dahmer, followed a troubled path. When I met him, he was struggling with homelessness and legal problems of his own. The trauma of his experience with Dahmer had left deep scars. People call me a hero, but I don't feel like one, he told me, eyes cast downward. I feel like a survivor, and sometimes I'm not even sure about that. His words highlighted another layer of Dahmer's legacy, the ripple effects of trauma extending far beyond his direct victims, touching lives in ways that might never fully heal. Edwards had escaped with his life, but not without damage. The night that made him famous also burdened him with memories and associations that proved difficult to bear. As my investigation continued, I obtained permission to hear recordings of Dahmer's confessions to the police. Sitting in a small room at the Milwaukee Police Department, headphones on, I listened to his voice methodically describing atrocities in the same tone someone might use to describe their daily commute. He detailed how he selected body parts to keep, which ones he photographed, which ones he consumed. Yes, consumed. Dahmer admitted to cannibalism with several victims, describing it as an attempt to make them part of him. I had to step outside twice during these sessions, gulping fresh air, trying to process what I was hearing. That night, I dreamed of refrigerators, filled with dismembered parts, of skulls painted and displayed like trophies. I woke up sweating, questioning my decision to dive so deeply into this case. The police recordings revealed aspects of Dahmer I hadn't seen in our interviews. With the detectives, he was more forthcoming about the sexual component of his crimes, describing necrophilic acts in graphic detail. He seemed to distinguish between different audiences, calibrating his disclosures based on who was listening. With me, he emphasized loneliness and abandonment. With police, he was more explicit about gratification. I began to wonder if the version of himself he presented to me was calculated to elicit understanding rather than disgust. This realization made me more cautious in our subsequent meetings. I started cross-referencing his statements with police records, looking for inconsistencies or manipulations. The Dahmer I thought I was coming to understand remained elusive, presenting different facets of himself to different observers. During our fifth interview, something shifted. Dahmer seemed more agitated than usual, his typically still hands now fidgeting with the edge of his prison uniform. "There's something I haven't told the police," he said suddenly, eyes meeting mine directly for perhaps the first time. My heart raced as he described another victim, one whose body had never been found, whose name had never appeared on any official list. He gave me details, a name, approximate date, location. I felt sick. This information made me both a journalist with an exclusive and the bearer of devastating news for yet another family. I promised Dahmer I would verify his claim before publishing anything, but the weight of his confession sat heavily on my shoulders as I left the prison that day. I spent weeks investigating this new lead, working with a detective I trusted. We found evidence suggesting Dahmer might be telling the truth. A missing persons report that matched his timeline, witnesses who placed the individual near Dahmer's hunting grounds. When confronted with our findings, Dahmer provided more details, some of which only the killer could know. Then came the twist. He admitted he'd fabricated portions of his confession about this victim, mixing truth with elaborate fiction. "I wanted to see if you'd come back," he said when I confronted him. "Everyone stops coming eventually." That moment crystallized something I'd been feeling throughout our interactions. Beneath the monstrous acts was someone pathologically terrified of abandonment, willing to do anything to keep people connected to him, even if that connection was built on horror. The manipulation infuriated me. I had spent countless hours following his lead, reopening wounds for a family searching for closure. I confronted him about the ethical implications of his lie, about the pain he had caused beyond his actual crimes. He listened without visible reaction, then said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to be different." The apology felt hollow, yet something in his tone suggested genuine limitation, as if he truly could not comprehend the normal boundaries of human interaction. I canceled our next scheduled interview, needing distance to regain my professional objectivity. When I returned 2 weeks later, he acted as if nothing had happened, picking up our conversation where we had left off before his fabricated confession. This incident became a turning point in my understanding of Dahmer, not as someone who chose evil, but as someone fundamentally incapable of functioning within the normal parameters of human relationship. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992. I attended every day, watching as families of the victims filled the courtroom with their grief and anger. Dahmer pleaded guilty, but insane, to 15 counts of murder. The trial wasn't about establishing guilt, but determining his mental state at the time of the killings. Was he a calculating killer who should spend life in prison, or was he driven by mental illness severe enough to warrant institutionalization? Expert witnesses dissected his psychology in clinical terms: necrophilia, paraphilia, psychopathy, borderline personality disorder. These clinical labels seemed wholly inadequate to describe the devastation he had caused. The courtroom itself became a theater of pain. Family members clutched photos of their loved ones, some crying quietly, others staring at Dahmer with undisguised hatred. Dahmer himself remained largely impassive, occasionally whispering to his defense attorney Gerald Boyle. The prosecution, led by Michael McCann, painted Dahmer as a calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing, who went to elaborate lengths to lure victims and evade detection. The defense argued that his compulsions were so powerful, his mental state so disturbed, that he couldn't conform his conduct to the law. Both narratives contained elements of truth, yet neither fully captured the man I had come to know through our interviews, someone who existed in a terrible middle ground, aware of the wrongness of his actions, yet unable to stop himself. The most powerful moments came when family members addressed the court. "I'm satisfied with the death penalty," said Rita Isbell, sister of victim Errol Lindsay, before launching into an emotional outburst directed at Dahmer himself. "I hate you, motherfucker! I hate you!" she screamed as she lunged toward him, restrained by court officers. Dahmer sat impassive through her pain, through all their pain. On February 15th, Judge Lawrence Graham determined that Dahmer was sane at the time of the killings and sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 936 years in prison. As the sentence was read, I watched Dahmer's face for any reaction. There was none, just that same empty gaze that had chilled me during our first meeting. After the trial, public interest in Dahmer began to wane. The sensational headlines faded. The television news crews packed up and moved on to the next big story. But for the families of his victims, for the communities most affected by his crimes, there was no moving on. I stayed in Milwaukee for several more months, attending support groups, community meetings, and memorial services. I watched as people grappled not just with grief, but with difficult questions. How had the system failed so completely? Why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? What did it mean that so many of the victims came from marginalized communities? These conversations revealed that Dahmer's crimes had exposed fault lines in American society, issues of race, class, sexuality, and whose lives we value. In prison, Dahmer initially kept to himself, but gradually began attending Bible study sessions led by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister who baptized him in May 1994. I continued our interviews, now focused on his claimed religious conversion. Was it genuine remorse or another manipulation? "I deserve whatever happens to me," he told me. during what would be our penultimate meeting. I can't undo what I've done. All I can do is try to understand why I did it. He spoke of forgiveness and salvation with the same flat affect he had used to describe his crimes. I remained skeptical, but noted that he no longer denied responsibility for his actions. Our final interview took place in early November 1994. Dahmer seemed unusually reflective, perhaps sensing his time was growing short. He spoke about his childhood, about moments when he felt things might have gone differently. There was a time before all this, he said quietly. I remember being a kid, collecting insects, being normal. I don't know when that changed, or why. For the first time, I felt I was seeing genuine introspection rather than performance. He asked about my life, my work, seemingly interested in something beyond himself. As our time ended and guards came to take him back to his cell, he thanked me for listening. Not many people want to understand, he said. They just want to hate. I didn't tell him I understood because I didn't. Not really. But I had tried, and perhaps that effort was what he had valued. On November 28th, 1994, while cleaning a bathroom at the Columbia Correctional Institution, Dahmer was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, who also killed another inmate during the same attack. Scarver later claimed God had told him to do it. When I heard the news, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. A sense that justice had been served more definitively than any court could provide, coupled with the journalist's frustration of losing a source, and the human sense of witnessing yet another life ended through violence. Many celebrated his death. Family members of victims expressed relief. But for me, there was an unsettling emptiness. The questions I had been pursuing died with him. I attended Dahmer's funeral, a small private affair with just his immediate family present. His father, Lionel, nodded at me in recognition but said nothing. What was there to say? His son was gone, leaving behind a legacy of pain and horror that would forever define the Dahmer name. As the simple casket was lowered into the ground, I thought about all the graves of Dahmer's victims, spread across different cemeteries, different cities, all those lives cut short by the broken man now returning to dust. There was no sense of closure, no feeling that the story had reached its natural conclusion. Just a quiet ending to a life that had caused incalculable suffering. After Dahmer's death, I spent a year writing a book about my experience, investigating his case, and interviewing him. The process was cathartic but difficult. I struggled with nightmares, with the feeling that I had looked too long into an abyss. I questioned my motivations. Had I pursued this story out of genuine desire to understand, or out of the same morbid fascination that drove people to slow down at car accidents? In writing the final chapters, I realized that understanding Jeffrey Dahmer completely was impossible. Some darkness resists illumination, some questions have no satisfying answers. The book was published to mixed reviews. Some praised its psychological depth, others criticized what they saw as humanizing a monster. Both perspectives contained truth. Years later, I returned to Milwaukee and stood at the site where the Oxford Apartments once stood. The building had been demolished in 1992, leaving an empty lot that remained undeveloped as if the city itself couldn't decide what should replace it. Grass and weeds pushed through cracks in the remaining concrete foundation. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, I thought about the lives that had ended in that place, and about the dark journey that had brought me face to face with Jeffrey Dahmer. I thought about how thin the line sometimes seems between ordinary human damage and monstrous action. Most of us carry wounds, experience isolation, fear, abandonment, yet we don't turn to violence as the answer. What makes someone cross that line? After all my interviews, all my research, I still don't have a satisfying answer. Dahmer himself couldn't fully explain it. Perhaps that's what disturbs us most about cases like his. The suggestion that evil isn't always explicable, that sometimes the most horrific actions arise from impulses that begin as recognizable human emotions before twisting into something unrecognizable. I've spent years trying to understand the mind of a killer, to map the territory between damaged and dangerous. In the process, I've learned that this boundary is both wider and more permeable than we might wish to believe. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want to believe we could spot them coming. The truth is far more unsettling. Sometimes in the dark hours of early morning, I still hear Dahmer's voice, soft and matter-of-fact. I just wanted them to stay with me forever. The terrible, twisted logic of a broken mind reaching for connection in the only way it could imagine. A reminder that the darkest acts often begin with the most human of needs: to be seen, to be known, to not be left alone. In all of us exists the capacity for both light and dark, for connection and destruction. The distance between ordinary pain and extraordinary horror may be shorter than we think. This isn't to excuse what Dahmer did, nothing could, but to recognize that the seeds of monstrosity can take root in common soil. The question that haunts me isn't why Jeffrey Dahmer became what he became, but why more of us don't.